Hey everyone, I'm Supersonic7C, and welcome to Syntax Error, the show where I analyze topics that relate to game design and try to teach viewers how to develop their games. Today I'll be talking about game feel. Popularized by Steve Swank's book, this term, which is also sometimes known as game juice or audio-visual feedback, refers to the tangible sensation players feel thanks to feedback created by several different aspects of video games and the hardware used to play them. The better these stimulants are, the better the game feel will be, and by extension, the better the gameplay will feel to play. In theory, if the game feel is good enough, the gameplay stripped down to its core mechanics should still be enjoyable to interact with. Good game feel is created differently in every game, and there are countless tips and tricks that developers can add into their gameplay to improve the quality of game feel, but it always comes down to finding ways to make gameplay satisfying or engaging. During gameplay, anything that rewards the player by appealing to them or to their senses makes the gameplay more satisfying, and anything that interests the player or immerses them by giving players a sense of realism makes the gameplay more engaging. It's very important for every game to have good game feel because without it, even gameplay that's designed in a very entertaining or enjoyable way can become boring and annoying. Preferably, gameplay should always be both satisfying and engaging to guarantee the creation of good game feel, but that can be very difficult to pull off for some games. Luckily, if the gameplay is lacking on one front, good game feel can still be created by compensating and making sure the gameplay is at least very satisfying or very engaging. So what aspects contribute to game feel and give players feedback that helps make the gameplay satisfying or engaging? There's some debate over the answer to this question, but I personally believe there are 4 aspects that affect game feel: visuals, audio, controls, and finally, how the gameplay itself is designed. If all of these aspects help the gameplay become satisfying or engaging while working in harmony, good game feel is usually achieved. Arguably, the most important aspect that affects game feel is the game's visuals. Now, when I say visuals, I don't mean graphics. While not having appealing, high-resolution graphics that all artistically fit together can negatively affect the overall game feel, having higher quality or more realistic graphics normally don't improve game feel in any way. Also, when it comes to visuals in general, not including visual cues like reflections, shadows, or a body for first-person playable characters, and not including an intuitive heads-up display can make the gameplay less immersive, and therefore, less engaging. Additionally, if the visuals confuse players by not clearly conveying objects or whatever is happening on the screen, the game feel can be ruined. But there are other, more specific ways visuals can improve game feel or hinder it if they're poorly executed. Animations are extremely important, and without them, the gameplay can feel stiff, visually uninteresting, and lifeless. Animations can also help immerse and satisfy players, but if they're poor quality, they can also cause the entire game to feel awful, or at the very least, jarring to play. To avoid poor quality animations, make sure they clearly convey whatever action is being performed, they fit the tone of the action, and above all else, make sure they aren't poorly animated. How do you avoid animating poorly? Well, sadly, the answer to that question is a long one. So long, in fact, that I'll have to be a topic for another episode. For now, I'll just be focusing on the other, more specific ways animations can improve game feel, like by having a good sense of weight and power. Creating a sense of weight is a bit self-explanatory. Basically, just have animations reflect the physical properties of the objects involved using your own knowledge of them. These properties can include anything from how heavy, sturdy, and dense an object is, to how it absorbs impact or reacts to elements like liquid, gases, or even wind. For example, a leaf being blown into a body of water may quickly move with the wind, but then gently fall into the water and only make a small ripple before staying afloat on its surface. Creating a sense of power is far less self-explanatory. To break it down and hopefully make the process simpler, divide the action you're animating into 3 segments: the build-up, the movement, and the reaction. If I were to divide up the action of punching someone, the build-up would be the attacker making a fist and pulling their arm back, the movement would be the arm extending and contacting the other person, and the reaction would be the person who got hit recoiling while the attacker's fist lingers in the air or moved with the other person. Changing the animation's timing or speed it takes to complete each of these segments can be referred to as tweening or easing, and it allows the animation to convey different senses of power and weight. A good way to make an action feel powerful is by having a relatively long build-up, a quick movement, and finally, a long reaction. In other words, favor the result of the action rather than the action itself. On the other hand, a good way to make an action feel weak is by having a relatively long build-up, a movement that takes just about as long as the build-up, and a quick reaction. When it comes to conveying weight, changing the timing in relation to gravity can help objects feel lighter or heavier. For example, light objects normally take a while to fall to the ground, while heavy objects normally take a while to be lifted. As long as they're brief, including freeze frames can also help improve the player's sense of satisfaction. Freeze frames are created by pausing and holding a frame of an animation segment. Most of the time, this comes in the form of holding the first or last frame in an animation segment to emphasize whatever action is being performed. The game Pac-Man Championship Edition 2 uses freeze frames to make its gameplay far more satisfying. Whenever the player is about to eat a chain of ghosts, Pac-Man and the ghosts freeze right before the player automatically continues to eat the entire chain. This freezing could get annoying if it was dragged out for too long or if it occurred too often, but because it's only repeated when players start to eat ghosts, and because it only lasts for less than a second, it creates a great sense of impact and satisfaction. In addition to pausing frames, you can also change how the animations feel by experimenting with the number of animation frames per second that are in each segment. For instance, having a large amount of frames in the build-up, a relatively small number of frames in the movement, and only a few frames for the reaction often makes animations seem fast and powerful. Remember though, the less frames are in an animation, the quicker that animation needs to be. Having a small amount of frames for a slow animation will almost always end up looking very choppy. Also, keep in mind that the frames of animations and speeds of actions don't always need to line up with reality. While including realistic build-up animations for non-playable characters like enemies works great and makes the gameplay more fair by allowing the player to telegraph their movements long before an action is performed, realism will most likely have to be ignored entirely for most actions performed by the player. This is because the more time that passes between the input of a command and the execution of the action, the more sluggish the gameplay will feel. A very common example of this is how most games make the build-up for jumping practically non-existent and don't include any animation for characters bending their knees. Even though this defies physics and doesn't make any sense in most situations, realism is sacrificed to prevent the game from feeling far less responsive. Now, it is possible to include realistic build-up animations for the playable character without destroying the game feel if the entire game is designed around that action being slower and delayed, but this can be somewhat risky. There's still a chance that adhering to reality will cause the gameplay to feel slower and the game feel to be worse for some players, no matter what. Speaking of realism though, exaggerating reality visually can also help improve game feel. This can be done by including animations that intentionally go off model and warp proportions during certain movements. The most common form of these animations is referred to as squash and stretch animations. These are cartoony looking animations that distort proportions in an exaggerated way to simulate a sort of momentum. Animating the proportions of an object or character squashing is a great way to convey a sense of impact, and animating them stretching is a great way to show speed. Lethal League is a fast-paced competitive multiplayer game about striking opponents with a ball. It uses squash and stretch animations to do this very thing and give its ball a great sense of impact and speed, which makes it far more satisfying to hit and engaging to watch. Notice that whenever the ball squashes when hitting an object or stretches when picking up speed, its mass and volume always stays roughly the same. By that, I mean the ball never seems to grow or shrink, and when one side is compressed or extended, the other sides react accordingly. For example, when the ball stretches out, it also gets thinner, and when the ball squashes down, it widens. I highly advise always adhering to this rule when using squash and stretch animations unless you're willing to risk the game feel by having it look like the object is breaking the laws of physics and gaining length or width. The next type of animation that exaggerates visuals is called smear animations. Similar to stretch animations, Smear animations, or smear frames, are used to give a satisfying sense of speed by replicating motion blur. Unlike stretch frames, which imply the object is physically stretching thanks to momentum, these animations do not have to compensate widths or heights in order to keep roughly the same mass and volume. In fact, because smear animations are simply meant to be motion blur, it will most likely look very odd and horribly unrealistic if this is done. Another way to simulate motion blur is to create animations that include duplicates of the moving object. This is what's sometimes called multiples, but if you're anything like me, you've probably heard it referred to as an afterimage animation. In addition to giving the player a satisfying sense of speed, these can also be used to convey a sense of power or skill, but only if they're on screen long enough for the players to notice them. Additionally, these animations can also make gameplay more engaging simply because they look visually interesting in motion. When including any of these exaggerated animation effects, remember that they're normally meant for 2D animations. If you're making a game with 3D animations and want to include them, prepare to spend far more time and resources on creating these effects. If you don't, they'll most likely come across as visual glitches to most players who notice them, and fail to improve the game feel in any way. Fair warning though, they may look like visual glitches regardless to some players who aren't used to seeing these techniques in 3D animations. Another type of animation that often improves game feel but can take large amounts of time and effort to implement are what I call buffer animations, or buffers for short. These are animations that are included between two other animations to make the transition between them smoother or more natural. In games, it's very common for playable characters to have dozens of unique animations for specific gameplay actions. Unlike most animated movies or shows, which usually don't reuse animations and can create transitions between all actions thanks to animators knowing exactly what will happen and when it will happen, animations that are shown during gameplay are meant to be reused, and each animation is separated from the others so that they can be played in any order at any time. This means the playable character often looks as if it's snapping between different movements in the blink of an eye. Luckily, this usually goes unnoticed by many players, but it becomes far more noticeable when characters go from something like a calm idle animation to instantly sprinting across the screen to suddenly standing still and punching before returning to the calm idle animation. Some developers try fixing this by having all animations start and end with the same pose, or by creating procedural animations using programming. But both of these methods normally don't look good and cause the animations to feel disjointed from one another. Manually creating buffer animations, on the other hand, can be used to include transitions between all of those actions while also preventing immersion from being broken and making the gameplay feel smoother. Buffer animations are included in a lot of games. For example, most games include animations for the characters starting to run from their idle animation, and animations of them returning to their idle animation by screeching to a halt after running. But that's the thing, almost all buffer animations are for transitions to or from idle animations. Very few games include them for transitions between two actions, like going from running to punching or from one attack to another. Now, I know what you may be thinking. It makes sense to not include buffer animations for these actions and to make sure they're as snappy as possible. After all, I said it myself, the more time it takes to complete an action, the worse gameplay can feel, but this issue can be avoided if the buffer animations are taken into account and the total time it takes to complete each action isn't long enough to feel sluggish. Batman Arkham Asylum includes multiple buffer animations for combat, which could easily cause the gameplay to feel sluggish and annoying. Instead, because all the buffer animations are very quick and snappy, it helps everything have a satisfying sense of flow to it in addition to it looking far more natural and engaging. Other than this, buffer animations can also be used to include some realism and make the gameplay seem more natural by implying the character performing them is in a different mental state. In most games, the idle animation is usually a very calm or neutral pose. Because of this, it can sometimes look very odd to have the character go from energetic fighting to standing in a calm, neutral position in mere seconds. To avoid this, the game Jak and Daxter includes a buffer animation that serves as an alternate idle animation. When the player stands still, the default calm one plays, but after they've just attacked, a more energetic idle animation plays before transitioning back to the calm idle animation after a few seconds. This adds some realism to the characters and helps the player stay immersed while also making the gameplay look smoother and more visually interesting. Be careful when it comes to including buffer animations though. While it would be nice to have buffer animations for every combination of two actions, Animations cost time and resources, so make sure to not go overboard by including too many of them. Try to stick to the essentials at first, like the ones that lead to and from the idle animation. Then, add any extra buffer animations that you can afford for frequently repeated action combinations. The same goes for creating alternate versions of animations, regardless of whether or not they're used as a buffer. Yeah, they can also improve game feel by helping the gameplay stay immersive and interesting, but they can also burn through resources. So just like with buffer animations, I recommend only including alternate animations if an action is heavily and frequently repeated during gameplay. Now, creating animations aren't the only visual way to improve game feel. Visual effects can be used as well. These are visuals that can be created with animations, but are normally pulled off at least in part using programming in order to avoid large amounts of work. Most of the time, visual effects are used to simulate the way something looks or acts in reality in order to avoid something feeling wrong or off. These effects can come in countless forms. Particle effects are a common visual effect that improves game feel by helping certain objects look more realistic and visually interesting. Particle effects are used to create things like embers rising from a fire, falling snow, bits of debris exploding from a barrel, bugs flying around a light source, energy tailing behind a magical orb, and smoke dispersing from an explosion. All of these could be created by animating them manually, but this would be a large amount of work, especially if the object needs to move around and the particles need to be affected by wind or momentum. This task becomes incredibly less time-consuming if the particles themselves are the only thing animated, and their movements are pulled off by programming physics. Artificial motion blur is another common visual effect that's meant to recreate what humans and cameras see when an object moves by very quickly without spending large amounts of time creating multiples or smear animations. This is included in games for many reasons. Some developers of horror games include artificial motion blur because they believe it'll help their game become scarier. Other developers include it to help their games look more cinematic or more visually interesting, but it can also be used with the intention of making the game more immersive and realistic. If this worked as intended, artificial motion blur could help the gameplay become both satisfying and engaging. But sadly, most players, myself included, just find this effect to be nauseating and an eyesore. Don't get me wrong, it can work if it's used in moderation and if it doesn't blur the objects on screen past the point of recognition, but it's also somewhat redundant since the human eye should naturally create its own motion blur if the objects are moving by fast enough. Regardless, if you do plan on adding this visual effect, make sure it's optional and that it can be easily turned off at any point, because not only does it make people sick, it often eats up a large amount of the computer's resources, which can easily cause the game to lag or even crash on some machines. Another visual effect that is much more likely to add some satisfaction and impact to the gameplay while also making it more engaging is normally referred to as slow motion. This effect usually takes control away from the player and intentionally slows down one or all of the visuals to put more emphasis on the action in an attempt to make it more interesting and rewarding. In the past few years, this effect has become something of a trend or cliche to include in games. It's popped up so much that some people believe slow motion should never be used and feel it's a cheap or lazy substitute meant to trick players into thinking an action in a game has good game feel. While I personally think that's a bit extreme and don't advocate banning any visual effect entirely, I do believe that slow motion doesn't need to be included in every game, and that it can often feel tacked on or useless, but that doesn't mean it can't be useful. When including slow motion, it needs to be used in moderation. It is great for making an action more satisfying and engaging, but it usually only works once or twice before quickly outstaying its welcome. Many games take control away from the player and slow down the gameplay whenever they complete certain tasks or perform a powerful move. This may feel satisfying the first time, but if it's repeated too often, it'll most likely lose its charm, become annoying, and feel like the game is dragging itself out. Flashing is another visual effect that can add to the player's sense of satisfaction. Flashing refers to when the entire screen or an object suddenly changes in some way for a split second. The most common form of this is when an enemy flashes when hit. Flashing can also be used to describe when the entire screen flashes to signify a powerful attack, or when an object quickly flashes right before it explodes or shatters. All of these forms of flashing can give players a satisfying sense of impact or power while also helping to inform players that they've definitely affected the object in question, which helps avoid confusing the player. Although, if flashing is used too often, it can become annoying or harsh on the eyes. If you include any type of flashing in your game, no matter how small or infrequent, I'd make sure it can be turned off at any point, but definitely make sure to include an epilepsy warning beforehand to prevent your players from being hurt and to prevent yourself from possibly falling into legal trouble. So far, all of the visual effects I've mentioned have been somewhat simple in one way or another. Not all visual effects are like this. Parallax scrolling is a fairly complex example of a visual effect that's meant to simulate what's called relative motion in reality. This term, which is also referred to as motion parallax, describes the visual depth cue humans see when observing objects that move past us. You may have noticed motion parallax if you've ever looked out the window in a moving vehicle and noticed that objects closer to you seem to move fairly quickly and sometimes seem to move so fast that they're a blur, while objects much farther away seem to move far slower in comparison. How does this make sense? Assuming the objects are stationary, then the only thing moving is you, and thus everything should seem to be moving away at your speed. So why do we see motion parallax? Well, everyone has a field of vision that increases the farther away it is from their eyes, which basically means you can see less of an area the closer it is to your eyes. To see what I mean, look straight ahead and place your open hands next to the sides of your head, as if you were about to cover your ears. Make sure they're far enough back and in a spot where you can't see them at all. Now, while continuing to look straight and without moving your head, slowly move your hands forward without lowering or elevating them. This should allow you to see your hands gradually come into your field of view. An alternate way to test this is by looking at an area that's being obscured by an object, like the area behind a computer monitor or behind a pillar. Make sure the object has some amount of distance between itself and the area behind it, because the farther the distance, the more noticeable the results will be. Then, look forward and point your head at the object so it's in the middle of your vision. Once you've done this, look around the object by only moving your eyes and take note of how much of the area you can see behind it. Now, slowly lean your head closer towards the object or move the object closer to you without moving it or your head in any other direction. The closer you move towards the object, the less you should see of the area behind it. So how does our field of vision, which is also called our field of view, or our FOV for short, create motion parallax in reality? Well, like I said, the farther away your FOV gets from your eyes, the bigger it is. To visualize it, think of your FOV like a cone with the tip located at your eye and the base located as far as you can see. Now, if there were two objects moving through your FOV at the exact same speed and at roughly the same distance from your eye, they would appear to move past you at exactly the same speed, and you wouldn't notice any motion parallax. Although, if the two objects are moving at the exact same speed but are at noticeably different distances from your eye, say in the foreground and the background of your vision, the foreground object, which is closer, will enter your FOV after the background object. This is because that object is farther away, and the further something is from your eye, the more room there is for that object to be seen. Then the foreground object will exit your FOV before the background object for the same reason, thus causing motion parallax, which makes it seem to move by faster and sometimes cause it to be blurred if it enters and exits your FOV very quickly. To clarify, motion parallax won't only be seen for two objects on two different layers. It'll be seen no matter how many objects or layers there are. Assuming all objects are stationary, the closest object will always seem to move the fastest, while the next farthest object will always seem to move slower, and the object farther than that will always seem to move even slower, and so on until the farthest object, which will always seem to move the slowest. When both you and the objects aren't stationary, objects moving in the opposite direction of you seem to move faster in relation to its speed, and objects moving in the same direction of you appear to move slower in relation to its speed, as long as it's not moving at roughly the same speed as you. If both you and the object are moving at roughly the same speed and in the same direction, it will stay at roughly the same position in your FOV. If the distance between your FOV and the object was changing as you moved past each other, this would cause the object to either appear to decrease speed as it was moving farther away, or appear to increase speed as it was getting closer. This is all well and good, but how is motion parallax created in video games? Luckily, in games with realistically proportioned three-dimensional areas, motion parallax should still be seen without any extra work, regardless of the camera angle. Although, for two-dimensional games, or any game without realistically proportioned 3D areas, motion parallax usually won't be correctly seen, but there is a way to include it. Parallax scrolling simulates motion parallax in games like this by manually creating layers of 3D objects or 2D images and moving the foreground, background, and midground layers at different speeds in relation to the movement of the playable character or the game's camera. This helps give players the illusion of depth, even if the game is using completely two-dimensional graphics. Parallax scrolling is very important because without depth, levels or areas can look flat, boring, and unrealistic, which can drastically hurt the game feel. Additionally, if the parallax scrolling doesn't look right, moving the playable character in general will most likely feel wrong and disjointed from the rest of the world because certain layers in the foreground, midground, or background aren't moving at roughly the correct speed. The first Sonic the Hedgehog is well known for its parallax scrolling. The background of every level has multiple layers that all move by at different speeds in relation to how fast the player is moving. For the most part, this looks great, but there are some exceptions. In the Starlight Zone levels, the stars may not seem like they're moving quite right. The reason this may look wrong is because according to motion parallax, when we see one layer of objects moving by faster than another layer of objects, this means the faster layer is closer to our eyes. In the game, the stars should move by the slowest, or maybe even not move at all since they're so far away, but because they move so quickly, it gives the impression that the stars are actually closer to the player than the buildings in the background, which move by at a much slower pace. Because of this, the player's sense of speed can feel all wrong in these levels, which makes the gameplay far less satisfying. Not only that, but this also creates an incorrect sense of depth, which makes the gameplay far less engaging as well. This is why it's very important to get the speeds of every layer right. So how do you do that? Well, assuming my research is accurate, there are formulas you can use to calculate the mathematically correct speed each layer should be moving based off their intended distance from the player. I could easily be wrong because, I'll admit, physics this complicated currently goes way over my head, but I believe these formulas are referred to as the motion over pursuit law. I would explain this law, but I honestly don't trust that I understand it, so I'll just include some links in the description of this video in case you want to try and take a crack at it. If you're like me and these formulas look as if they're in an alien language, don't worry, you don't need to use them. In fact, almost everyone just estimates how fast the layers should move through trial and error or by looking up reference videos. Just visualize how far away the layer should be and try different speeds relative to the movement speed of the player or camera while simulating the rules of motion parallax until it looks roughly the correct speed and distance. This may take a while at first, but once you get used to it, you'll be able to estimate the speeds of future layers much faster. When estimating, one other thing that needs to be kept in mind is that the implied speed of the playable character's movement animations must match up with the movement speed of the foreground, background, and midground layers. For example, if the playable character is shown to be running but the layers are moving too slow, this can give off the impression that the character lacks traction, or that the world is actually much larger than intended. On the other hand, if the playable character is shown to be walking but the layers are moving too fast, this can give off the impression that the world is much smaller than intended, or that the character is moving in slow motion and seemingly sliding across the ground. Either one of these examples can also warp the parallax scrolling and cause everything to seem too far away or too close. Depending on how your game is programmed, this may be a parallax scrolling issue or an animation issue, but if these don't match up, the game feel is pretty much guaranteed to be ruined. In addition to both animations and visual effects, there is another way game feel can be affected by visuals. Many gameplay cameras stay at the same angle and the same distance from the player for the entire game, but they don't always have to be so stiff and unchanging. As long as the camera doesn't change too often or too drastically, including what I call camera effects, like changing the camera angle or altering how the camera moves, can help the gameplay become far more engaging and sometimes even more satisfying. Shaking is a camera effect that can improve the gameplay in both of these ways. Usually, shaking refers to the camera moving up and down or side to side, but it can also refer to another visual effect similar to flashing or freeze frames. The visual effect is commonly used to give objects an elastic or rubbery feeling, but both the visual and camera effect are often used to accompany powerful things, like explosions or very strong attacks. In reality, something exploding or breaking apart can cause the ground or objects near it to shake, and when objects are struck by something powerful, it can cause them to shake as well. This is why shaking is associated with power, and why both effects help give players a sense of impact and realism. While the visual effect is normally only used on single objects and barely improves realism, using the camera effect to shake the entire screen is great for adding a sense of realism as well as a sense of power, especially in first-person games. Be careful though, shaking the entire camera can easily annoy players and make them motion sick. Countless first-person games include a form of camera shaking called head bobbing that's meant to increase immersion and allow players to feel as if they're really taking steps when they move. 99 out of 100 times, this backfires completely. In fact, PT is the only game I can think of where head bobbing actually worked and helped make the gameplay more engaging. The reason it normally backfires is because humans don't ever see head bobbing when they walk unless they're looking for it. Our brain purposefully edits it out of our sight and ignores it so we don't get motion sick. PT managed to pull it off by making sure it stayed so subtle that it could easily be ignored. If it's too prominent, adding head bobbing to games will usually just worsen the game feel and cause players to feel motion sickness. Tilting and rotating the camera is another visual effect that can create motion sickness if it's overused. Outlast is a first-person game that allows players to tilt the camera from side to side at will to peek around corners without being detected. It also gives players the ability to rotate the camera behind them while running so they can check to see if they're being chased. If this was automated, the camera changing suddenly could have gotten very annoying and caused players to feel sick or not be able to see where they were going, but because these movements are mapped to buttons, the gameplay becomes far more dynamic and visually interesting while also adding a sense of realism by helping the playable character look and feel more like an actual person. Although, tilting and rotating the camera is rarely used in this way. Most of the time, it's automated and it's used to focus the player on objects, characters, and certain events like something happening in the background or a hazard following the player. Doing this can help the gameplay feel more dynamic and engaging, but this effect can also be used to show scale. The game, Shadow of the Colossus, is all about fighting and climbing giant creatures called Colossus. If the Colossi didn't feel as if they were actually much larger than the playable character, the gameplay would take a massive hit and feel much less satisfying and engaging. One of the ways the game gives its Colossi a sense of scale is by having the camera tilt up when a Colossus is too tall to normally fit on the screen. Not only does this help the players keep track of what they're fighting, it also helps them feel as if they're actually being towered over by a giant creature. Additionally, Shadow of the Colossus uses another camera effect to give players a sense of scale and improve the overall game feel. The camera will often zoom in and out depending on what's happening on the screen. Zooming out is also used to track the Colossi and give them scale, but zooming in is used to improve game feel as well by helping players focus on what they're looking at. This helps the gameplay become more engaging by emphasizing what the players are looking at when aiming their bow and emphasizing the movement or attacks of the smaller Colossi. Other than this, zooming in and out is also used to make attacking the Colossi more satisfying and engaging. Slightly zooming the camera in when attacking the Colossi's weak point helps satisfy the player by allowing them to focus on the animation, and drastically zooming the camera out when the Colossi has been defeated helps engage players by allowing them to fully see the consequences of their actions. Much like with all the other camera effects, zooming in and out can become annoying and sometimes create motion sickness, especially if the movement is a very quick, drastic change. Although, this too can be avoided in the same way by making sure the camera effect isn't repeated too often. The audio aspect of game feel goes hand in hand with the visual aspect, hence why game feel is often referred to as audio-visual feedback. While this aspect may not be anywhere near as complicated, it is just as important, and there are multiple ways it can improve or hinder the overall game feel. including surround sound, making sure you have high quality audio, and avoiding easily recognizable stock audio are 3 ways audio can be used to help improve game feel. Even making sure you don't have poor voice acting for any reason can help the gameplay become more immersive and engaging, but when it comes to audio, nothing affects game feel more than sound effects. These are pre-recorded sounds that accompany visuals to help them feel more impactful or at the very least more realistic and engaging. In order for sound effects to improve game feel like this, they need to fit whatever action they're meant to accompany. This means every sound effect should complement the length of the animation, mirror the action's level of impact, sound believable, and most importantly, sync up with the animation. For example, say you want to include a footstep sound effect for a walking animation. First off, you'll need a sound effect that's short and can be repeated fairly quickly. This is because, in real life, the sound a footstep makes is normally short. This is also because the sound of a footstep very rarely overlaps with the sound of the next footstep. Under normal circumstances, this doesn't even happen when someone is running, so this needs to be taken into account or the sound effect will feel wrong. Second off, because this is meant to be the sound of walking, the sound effect can't be too impactful and shouldn't sound like someone is sprinting or stomping their foot on the ground. Third off, the sound effect will also need to sound believable and fit the environment, tone, and even any other sound effects already included in the game. In this example, let's say the player will be walking on grass and that the gameplay has a serious tone. When it comes to matching tones, all you need to do is remember that in virtually every situation, comical tones work well with exaggerated and unrealistic sound effects, but can also work well with realistic sound effects, while serious tones almost exclusively work with realistic sound effects. The same goes for footstep sound effects, so for a serious tone, a realistic sound effect of someone walking on grass should be fine. Just make sure the sound effect also sounds as if it's from the same area as every other sound effect and that it has the same level of quality. Finally, once you've found a sound effect that satisfies all 3 of these requirements, it's time to sync it up with the animation. This is very important because if the sound effect doesn't sync up properly and the player notices, the game feel can take a massive hit. To sync it up, analyze the animation and sound effect itself, then use your knowledge of reality to estimate when the sound effect should play. When you have an estimate, I would double check by performing a few simple tests or by doing some light research to make sure you're correct. In this case, and in most cases involving footstep sound effects, there are actually 2 sounds that play. The sound of the heel hitting the ground, and the sound of the rest of the foot or base hitting the ground. When walking, these 2 sounds are usually farther apart in comparison to running, which causes both sounds to be fairly close together. Regardless for walking or running, the heel sound will most likely be at least slightly more gentle or light sounding than the second sound. Sometimes, when walking, the heel part of the sound will be virtually silent or very low. The sound's low volume can sometimes cause it to be cut from the sound file by accident. So pay close attention to the sound effect and make sure you're not syncing up the heel sound with the bass hitting the ground or vice versa. Also make sure that having 2 segments of the footstep sound effect fits the animation. Some walking animations don't include frames for the heel hitting the ground, so having a sound effect that includes this may feel incorrect. Once you sync up each sound effect with each footstep, you may feel that it still sounds off or incorrect. This is probably because the same sound effect is being repeated several times. When sound effects are quickly repeated, they usually lose their ability to improve game feel and start to sound fake or unnatural. To prevent this and actually improve the game feel, I highly recommend using multiple sound effects from the same or a similar source for each action, or at the very least using multiple versions of the same sound effect that have been slightly altered in pitch. Although, repeated sound effects aren't always bad. For example, as long as the sound effect isn't irritating, having the same sound effect play every time players pick up a collectible can be very satisfying even if the sound is played in very quick succession. Changing the pitch of collectible sound effects can feel great too, especially if the pitch gradually gets higher with every collectible, but variation isn't always necessary. In fact, including multiple versions of the same sound effect can feel wrong in certain situations. Something that isn't prone to sound different every time, like a gun or machine, can benefit from only playing one sound effect. In this case, with the footsteps, I would include at least 3 sound effects and randomly repeat them in a way that makes it impossible for the same sound effect to play directly after itself. Even with this system, because the sound effects are repeated so quickly and so often, it'll be very easy for the player to notice them repeating. If you can, I highly advise including double or even triple the bare minimum to make it that much harder for players to notice. Still, try not to overdo it. Not every game needs 100 variations of footsteps sound effects. Usually, including such a large number of variations will just be a waste of time, memory, or resources. Don't get me wrong though, having such a large number of variations can improve game feel, but it's rare that this will improve it more than the alternative of roughly 10 to 20 variations. Super Mario Maker is a rare example where including so many variations paid off. The game's primary focus is to allow players to create their own platforming levels. Players can include and place over 60 objects in their levels. Every time an object is placed, a sound effect plays of the name of that object being spoken in a distorted voice. These sound effects then change in pitch to match the current note of the background music. This means that there are hundreds of variations for the simple task of placing an object. Normally this would be overkill, but because creating levels, and by extension placing objects, is such a large part of the gameplay, even hearing roughly 60 of the same sound effects over and over could easily cause the gameplay to become very boring and annoying. Adding so many variations helps the game avoid or at least prolong this while also preserving the game feel. So, if walking is the central part of the game and potentially the main source of entertainment or gameplay for extended periods of time, then it's probably best to include a very large amount of footstep variations. For less extreme situations, I would just use this rule of thumb: the more prominent the sound effect is and the more it's repeated, the more variations should be included, but don't include more than roughly 10 or 20 unless the repetition is still very noticeable even when randomized. Similar to this, another way to include variations and help the gameplay become more engaging is by changing sound effects based off the context of the action. This is commonly done with footsteps by having different sounds play based on whatever type of material the player is stepping on, but this can be applied to pretty much any sound effect. For example, instead of just having the same punch sound effect play every time a player attacks something, you could have a different sound effect play based off the effectiveness of the punch. A common form of this is often referred to as the tink sound effect. Sound effects like this one are used to show that an enemy or object is immune to the player's current method of attack. Games frequently use tink sound effects for this because it sounds weak and dainty. I personally always thought it sounded like someone throwing a small pebble or marble against a wall and it bouncing off, but I'm probably just reading too much into it. Regardless, adding variations to sound effects like this not only subtly helps convey information to the player, but it also improves the overall game feel by preventing attack sound effects from feeling overused and by lessening the impact of this attack, which increases the impact of other attacks by comparison. Now, sound effects aren't the only type of audio in games. When most people think of audio that affects game feel, they usually exclude music and believe it has little to no effect on it. In the past, I agreed with this and did the same. Nowadays, while I do think sound effects hold much more weight when it comes to game feel, I have changed my mind and I personally disagree. I believe that music can improve game feel or at the very least affect it in multiple ways. For starters, music hurts game feel when it sounds annoying to the player or when it clashes with the tone of the gameplay. Although, if the music sounds good to the player and if the music complements the tone instead, the gameplay can become much more engaging. Other than that, including dynamic music, which is music that changes along with the environment, gameplay events, or actions performed by the player, can help the gameplay become far more engaging. The game Banjo-Kazooie is famous for having music that fades into different versions of the same song as players travel around the environment. This helps the gameplay feel more alive while also immersing players and helping to prevent the gameplay from growing stale. Dynamic music can also be used to make the gameplay more satisfying. In Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance, when players are fighting a boss, the background music will transition between more energetic versions of the boss's theme. When the player has the upper hand against the boss, vocals are added to give players a sense of triumph. This makes wailing on the boss extremely satisfying and helps players feel like they're very skillful and awesome, which creates a feeling of excitement. Dynamic music can also help the gameplay become satisfying in non-action oriented games as well. Portal 2 is a puzzle game that sometimes divides its music into layers or alters it based off certain gameplay events. When the player runs on the orange gel or bounces on the blue gel, the music gets altered to help using them become that much more engaging. Some puzzles even gradually add layers to the background music as players get closer to the correct solution. This subtly guides them down the right path without most players ever noticing. This also gives players positive feedback and makes the gameplay more satisfying and engaging. I should mention though, dynamic music can be abused. Changing the background music randomly or too frequently can sometimes negatively affect game feel. Frequent transitions between songs can create a very jarring feeling and annoy or even confuse players, especially if the songs transition back and forth in a matter of seconds. Additionally, replacing a unique or new theme with a theme that doesn't change for the whole game can cause both songs to lose their effect on the player and cease to be engaging, let alone satisfying in any way. A large part of creating good game feel comes down to how the game controls. If the controls aren't responsive and intuitive, more often than not, the game feel will completely fall apart. Very few things bother players more than unresponsive controls that suffer from input delay. When a player enters a command, they expect the corresponding action to be executed as soon as they finish inputting it, or at the very least, they expect to see a visual sign that it has started to execute. Alternatively, when players stop entering a command, they expect whatever action they were performing to stop, or at the very least, they expect to see a visual sign that it has started to stop. If they don't see either of these signs for any reason, even if this is an intentional choice, a disconnect is often created between the player and the game. Similarly, controls feel unresponsive when the player inputs a command and it fails to execute. This can be caused by a glitch, but it's usually caused by the inputted controls being delayed thanks to latency between the game, the display, and the input device. Latency, which is the delay in time it takes for data to be transferred either through the internet, through a cord, or both, isn't really a problem game developers can fix, but they can work around it by including a sort of grace period to allow commands to still be inputted. For example, say the player pressed the correct button to block an attack or jump over a gap at the very last second. Because what they're seeing on screen is delayed by a few milliseconds, and their command is also delayed by a few milliseconds, it's likely they'll fail even though they didn't do anything wrong. That normally shatters game feel, but including a grace period allows players to not be punished for inputting a command at the last second. How long the grace period should be depends on what hardware is being used, and that usually isn't limited to only one option, so it may be a good idea to include a grace period that's so big, players who inputted the command slightly late, even without latency, still aren't punished. Personally, I recommend this, but some developers see adding this big of a grace period as going too easy on the player. Regardless, I would include at least a small grace period to combat latency and help the game stay fair. Controlling the game can also feel unresponsive if the player doesn't have enough control over whatever they're playing as. One way to cause this is by not allowing players to perform certain actions at select times. This can be done effectively, but most of the time, limiting the player's controls for any reason hurts game feel and causes the gameplay to feel annoying or the controls to feel unresponsive. Even going from a fully powered or upgraded character to a weaker character when restarting a game can feel unresponsive and annoying. Because of this, I recommend devs avoid taking away power or control from the player during gameplay, and, if your game can support it, I recommend including a New Game Plus mode that allows players to keep some, if not all of their abilities they've already unlocked when restarting the game. Unresponsive controls are also often created when the movement of the playable character doesn't feel right and feels imprecise and off for any reason. Usually, this is caused by what's commonly referred to as floaty controls. Controls feel floaty to players when the playable character lacks the proper weight in some way, thus making movement imprecise and harder to estimate where they will stop or land. Another form of this is when controlling the playable character feels slippery. This feeling is often intentionally added in areas that contain ice, but it almost always bothers players whenever the playable character lacks friction or has too much momentum. Sometimes, unresponsive controls are also created when the gameplay feels too stiff, which means the playable character lacks the proper physics, like knockback, momentum, or the correct movement speed. To clarify, I don't mean to say that you can't have characters who float in the air, slide on ice, or move slowly. Yes, slow characters who float and slide may feel stiff, floaty, and slippery to control, but they don't have to, and all of these types of movement can still allow the gameplay to have good game feel. Rayman Legends pulls off all three of these examples and even pulls off taking control away from the player, but only because it compensates and always allows the player to maintain roughly the same level of control over the playable character throughout all of the gameplay. This is done in multiple ways. During floating segments and in slippery areas, the obstacles and levels are spaced farther apart to give players more time to react or a bigger margin of error. In underwater levels, the slow movement and absence of actions like floating and wall jumping is compensated by giving players more fluid control of the playable character. Although, these aren't the only ways to give players more control and prevent gameplay from feeling floaty, slippery, or stiff. You can prevent all three of these outcomes by making sure controlling the playable character has satisfying and engaging physics, momentum, and weight. Another way to prevent this is by making sure aspects like the playable character's movement speed and jump arc allow for precise controls. Doing all of this can be a very daunting task, which is why many developers use the great, extremely effective strategy of trial and error. Seriously, almost every dev keeps trying different movement speeds and physics until it feels good. Then they keep tweaking it until they believe it can't be noticeably improved. Yeah, this method can be a ton of work, and no one knows how long it'll take you, but in most cases, this is your only option because creating controls that feel good hasn't been broken down to an exact science. Maybe it will someday, but for now, to make the trial and error process easier and more efficient, I recommend programming some sort of system that allows you to quickly change how the playable character controls. You can do this however you want, but a common practice is to program player movement using 3 variables that can have their values changed at any time. One for the movement speed, another for the acceleration speed, and one last variable for artificial friction. You see, changing the values of these variables can help control how smooth and responsive the playable character's movement is. For example, having no acceleration when movement starts and no friction when movement stops will most likely create very stiff feeling, imprecise controls. Luckily, because there are values for acceleration and friction that can be easily changed at any time, you can quickly alter the gameplay until it feels smoother and precise. By the way, when changing values, I recommend that you start out making drastic changes and gradually make smaller changes until you start narrowing down what you believe are the best values. Say you try a value and it doesn't feel right, you can subtract half from it and see if that feels better. If not, then you can add half to the original value and go from there. Once you start narrowing it down, you can add or subtract a fourth and then start making minor changes when you've narrowed it down even more. Hopefully, using this method or one similar to it will help speed up the trial and error process. Just like when controls feel unresponsive, gameplay becomes less satisfying and engaging when control schemes aren't designed intuitively. In order for controlling the gameplay to feel intuitive, the controls must work in tandem with the gameplay while also being easy to understand and use no matter how complicated they are. Sadly, I can't just tell you what works well with every type of gameplay or what control schemes are the most intuitive because that answer is different for every type of game. Avoiding overcomplicated controls and explaining the control scheme in a simple and straightforward manner usually helps make the control scheme easy to understand and use, but that's not always the case. Additionally, having the control scheme follow some sort of logic that can be accurately predicted by the player without them being taught how to play the game can greatly help create intuitive controls. For example, having the right trigger in a racing game activate the gas while the left trigger activates the brake may be guessed by some players because triggers are similar to pedals in a real car and the gas pedal is on the right while the brake pedal is on the left. But not every game's control scheme can follow logic like this. Also, in general, control schemes that require players to move their hands or fingers across long distances in order to perform an action often makes the gameplay annoying or physically painful for some players, but even then this can create intuitive controls in rare cases. For these reasons, the only real advice I can offer is to test multiple control schemes no matter what, even if you've already found a control scheme that works great. I also recommend testing the traditional or stereotypical control schemes of whatever game genres you're working with as well. These are the control schemes most people who have a general knowledge of games think of when a game genre is mentioned. To demonstrate, when I mention the genre first-person shooter, a control scheme most likely pops into your head that looks something along the lines of this. That's the traditional or stereotypical first-person shooter control scheme. Some developers believe that you should always go with the first control scheme you think of in order to find the most intuitive and avoid alienating players. Usually, this ends up being the traditional control scheme of that game genre or one very close to it. Other developers believe stereotypical control schemes like this should be avoided as much as possible to make sure devs don't rely on them too much and stop creating new control schemes. While I do see where both of these mindsets are coming from, personally I believe traditional or stereotypical control schemes shouldn't be relied on, but I also believe they shouldn't be completely shunned. The stereotypical control schemes may not always be the best, most intuitive choice, but they usually became so widely used because of how often they can be intuitive. This is why I highly recommend testing multiple ideas including the traditional control scheme before making a decision. What might seem like the obvious answer at first may be less intuitive, may clash with the overall gameplay, or may create worse game feel in comparison to an alternate control scheme. Just imagine how different it would feel to play Super Smash Bros. Using the A button to jump instead of pressing up on the joystick. Yeah, some players believe pressing A feels just as good as pressing up, and many players found this control scheme to be confusing at first, but if a more traditional fighting game control scheme was chosen, jumping may have been left out, and directional attacks could have been limited to only one type of attack, or may have never been implemented. Using the A button to jump, or any control scheme for that matter, can feel great, but in this case, using the control scheme that allows for more directional attacks and allows jumping will most likely feel better in comparison, because this gives players more control over their characters and helps the gameplay become more engaging. Additionally, the greater number of attacks and jumping adds more depth to the game, while directional attacks add a greater sense of impact, which helps make attacking feel more satisfying. Game feel isn't only influenced by controls when it comes to the control scheme itself and how it feels to control the playable character. Other control-related aspects affect game feel as well. For one, how the camera moves and controls greatly affects how players feel when controlling their avatar. Different games require different types of cameras, and if the game's camera looks jarring at any point during gameplay for any reason, at best the game feel will most likely be destroyed, and at worst the game may also become practically unplayable or cause horrible motion sickness. Some developers try to avoid this by simply giving the player control of the camera at all times. For first-person or virtual reality games, this is great and practically required, but many control schemes require the camera to be at least semi-automated, either because the player can't always play the game and adjust the camera at the same time, or because constantly controlling the camera would feel like a chore. Semi-automated and even completely automated cameras can be simple, complex, or anywhere in between. Usually, all that matters when programming and designing them is that they smoothly track the player in an efficient and intuitive way that doesn't obstruct the player's view or make it harder to control the game. Many developers try to achieve this by making sure the camera always keeps the playable character in a set area, whether that be in the middle of the screen or off to the side of it. This can work great, but in some cases it'll make it difficult for players to react to obstacles and control the game. To solve this issue, the camera is often offsetted a bit to change the position of the playable character on the screen and allow the player to see farther ahead, above, below, or behind the playable character. Additionally, if the player changes directions, the camera is programmed to shift and the position of the playable character on the screen will often flip. In some games though, having the playable character switch screen positions every time the player changes directions can disorient the player and make precise movements harder to control. This is practically a death sentence for platformers of any kind, which is why Super Mario World includes a camera system with a lot of depth. Once the player moves the playable character to the center of the screen, assuming the character didn't start in that position, the camera will begin to move horizontally along with the player. Although, if the player changes direction, the camera won't move with the player immediately. Instead, the camera will stay still unless the player moves 16 pixels in one direction without turning around. Why 16 pixels, you ask? Well, I can't speak for the developers, but I'm willing to bet it's not a coincidence that the smallest platform in the game, a single block, is 16 pixels wide. Thanks to the camera moving this way, platforming is made much easier and players can precisely adjust their placement back and forth without having to worry about the camera movement throwing them off, even if they're only standing on a single block. That's not all though. Super Mario World's camera system helps make vertical movement more intuitive and easier to control as well. Whenever the player starts a level or enters a pipe, it activates a camera mode that was predetermined by the programmers of the game. There are 4 camera modes that all cause the camera to move differently. Under normal circumstances, and when the camera isn't auto-scrolling, the first stops the screen from scrolling vertically, the second stops the screen from scrolling both vertically and horizontally, the third locks the height of the camera in reference to the bottom of the screen, and finally the fourth locks the height of the camera in reference to the last platform the player stood on. Additionally, when the camera isn't locked completely, certain actions like climbing, swimming, flying, or running and jumping at full speed will temporarily unlock the camera and allow for free vertical movement. This is meant to prevent the player from moving off screen, but in rare situations, players can go off the camera if they run up a slope or jump higher than the top of the screen. The camera can be manually panned to the right and left, but not up and down, which is a shame since the player will sometimes be forced to make a blind jump if the camera didn't move the way the developers intended. Still, while they may not be perfect, these camera modes help every level and area in the game have a camera that complements precision platforming, intuitively works well with the level design, and avoids disorienting players. So I highly encourage developers to design and implement similar camera systems into their games. Giving players more precise control over their actions by changing how long they press and hold buttons or how far they tilt joysticks is another way the controls of a game can become more satisfying and engaging. This is commonly referred to as pressure sensitivity, and it gives the player an extra level of control that makes actions like regulating the height of a jump much easier and more accurate. Not only that, but pressure sensitivity can also make control schemes more efficient and intuitive. Think of it this way, say you want to make a game where you control a person's movement and have the ability to walk, run, or tiptoe. You could have the player walk by default when moving the left joystick and allow them to run by holding a button or tiptoe by holding a completely different button. This control scheme can work perfectly fine, but if the player wants to run or tiptoe for an extended period of time, they may get tired of holding the buttons. You could just have a button toggle between the different movement speeds, but toggling could get pretty annoying, especially if players accidentally press the button one too many times. Instead, solving the problem by implementing pressure sensitivity would allow the player to just tilt the joystick slightly to tiptoe, tilt it all the way to run, and use all the tilt angles in between to walk. Assuming this pressure sensitivity method doesn't clash with the gameplay, it would make the control scheme far more efficient and intuitive while also making the game more engaging and satisfying. Other than all of this, using different input devices or controllers can also affect game feel by giving players physical feedback. Motion controllers, virtual reality headsets, touchscreens, and other specialized input devices can all greatly immerse players and help keep them engaged. Using special input devices meant to mimic certain objects like a fishing rod, an arcade machine, or an instrument can even help satisfy players. Although, all of these input devices can bother players and cause the controls to feel unintuitive and annoying if they're not properly implemented into the gameplay, or if the gameplay has no reason to be controlled in this way. Because of this, I highly recommend not including them for the sake of following a fad or trying to be different, and only including them if it would truly improve the gameplay. Also, not everyone owns these devices, so keep in mind that if there's no option to use traditional input devices like a keyboard and mouse or controller, and if the alternate input device isn't guaranteed to be present, many players will be completely prevented from playing your game. Luckily, there are a few other ways traditional input devices can give the player physical feedback. Many games use control schemes or certain buttons and joysticks to mimic actions. For example, holding a button down to charge an attack, using a keyboard's number pad to enter a password, or even repeatedly hitting an object to open it can all give players physical feedback. Having the input device vibrate can also help improve game feel by giving the player physical feedback. Vibration can be used to make games more engaging by accompanying certain actions like something exploding nearby or the player landing on the ground from a large drop. The intensity and speed of vibration can also be regulated to make the game more engaging or satisfying. Countless games make great use of vibration and add a large amount of impact to the game by causing the controller to vibrate in short bursts when massive creatures perform certain actions like walking or striking the ground. In Little Big Planet, when players get close to hazards, the controller will start to vibrate and increase the vibration intensity as the player gets closer to the hazard, which helps make the gameplay more engaging and the controls more intuitive. Some controllers even allow you to regulate which sides of the controller vibrate. This can be used in a racing game to accompany when the player starts driving on grass instead of the road. Touching the grass on the left could cause the left side of the controller to rumble, touching the grass on the right could cause the right side of the controller to rumble, and completely driving on grass could cause the entire controller to rumble. Using the controller vibration in ways like this can greatly improve the game feel and make the gameplay much more engaging. The final aspect of games that affects game feel is how the gameplay itself is designed. Gameplay can be specifically designed to both satisfy and engage the player in multiple ways. A great way to do this is by adding a bit of spectacle to certain actions. For example, when the player attacks a barrel, it could just fall apart, and when players pick up collectibles, they could just disappear, but instead, the gameplay can become more satisfying if the barrels explode open when hit, and the collectibles fly into the player when collected. Hotline Miami adds spectacle in a different way by having enemies splatter blood everywhere when hit and collapse to the floor when killed, only to linger until the player finishes the level. The game could have easily just had the enemies flash red when hit and fade away when defeated, but instead the blood splatters help attacks feel more impactful, and the lingering corpses help immerse players while also adding to their satisfaction by showing them the onslaught they overcame. In addition to adding spectacle, countless gameplay mechanics like guns having recoil when fired, enemies becoming visibly damaged during battle, objects being knocked back when hit, more skillful maneuvers yielding better rewards, players being able to control themselves while in slow motion, bullets being larger than reality, or the environment changing in relation to the player's actions can all be included to improve game feel. Incorporating rhythm mechanics also works wonders when it comes to helping the gameplay be more satisfying and engaging. Rhythmically syncing up the audio with the visuals helps engage players, and when it's up to them to make sure it stays synced up, successfully playing the game in tempo can feel extremely satisfying, even in game genres that aren't normally associated with the rhythm game genre. Killer Instinct is a fighting game that adds a sense of rhythm to its gameplay. Not only will the music stutter in response to attacks and slow down or speed up when the visuals do the same, it also rewards players for winning a match by changing completely to accompany the winner's finishing combo on their opponent. During this combo, every time the winner strikes their opponent, a sound effect plays that sounds like a beat in a song. This sound effect can be chained together with similar sound effects in different pitches that accompany other attacks to create a dynamic song that's incredibly satisfying to rhythmically execute.
I'm afraid your path ends here.
Supreme victory!
How the player interacts with objects also affects game feel. Believable physics are important when it comes to making the game more engaging, but hitboxes are also extremely important. If they're too inaccurate or even too precise, interacting with these objects will look and feel wrong. Most of the time, hitboxes will want to be either slightly bigger than the object itself or slightly smaller depending on how the player interacts with them. Collectibles normally have larger hitboxes than their model because it's usually not a problem if the player accidentally picks them up, and this makes it easier for the player to collect them. Some objects may require multiple hitboxes to make interacting with and avoiding them easier. Enemies that damage the player on contact may need 2 hitboxes. One that's smaller than the enemy itself that deals damage to the player when touched, and another that's larger than the enemy so players can attack it without getting damaged. Another part of gameplay that influences game feel is level design. Poor, clunky level design can create an unenjoyable experience for the player and even confuse them, but level design that helps the player naturally flow from start to finish while also including interesting ideas can greatly improve how engaging the game is. Level design can even make the game more engaging by including set pieces like riding in a crashing ship, dodging a tidal wave, or being chased by something hazardous. Completing events like this or designing levels in a challenging way can satisfy the player while also engaging them. Speaking of which, the difficulty of the gameplay can both help and hinder the game feel as well. If a game is both fair and challenging, the overall game feel will be greatly improved. If you've ever felt excited because you accomplished something you deem impressive when playing a game, then you probably know exactly what I mean. It's very satisfying to pull off a difficult stunt, chain a long combo, figure out the solution to a puzzle, and decimate an enemy that gave you trouble in the past. Although, difficulty that's caused by unfair mechanics, random chance, memorization, unintuitive controls, or poorly designed audio-visual feedback almost always destroys game feel. This type of difficulty, which is commonly referred to as artificial difficulty, has a tendency of taking everything satisfying and engaging about a game and nullifying it by annoying the player or making them feel like their actions and skill don't matter. For these reasons, I highly recommend that you normally avoid using artificial difficulty, but there is something I feel I should mention. Artificial difficulty can actually create satisfaction, and a large amount of it too. You see, most of the time, in fair games, when a player completes a difficult challenge, a decent amount of satisfaction is lost thanks to them knowing, at least on a subconscious level, that the challenge was designed to be completed. This can be salvaged if designers avoid directly telling the player how to complete the task, and if they instead are allowed to figure it out on their own, or at least think they did thanks to hidden tutorials, but as long as the player knows the challenge was meant to be beat, some satisfaction will most likely be lost. Because of artificially difficult challenges being unfair by nature, they're not affected by this issue and players will often feel much more satisfaction if they complete them. This is why the Yellow Devil boss fight in the original Mega Man is one of my favorite bosses of all time. And you know what? I honestly despise fighting it! The entire fight is based off artificial difficulty, and unless you have extremely fast reflexes, it always comes down to memorizing the pattern of projectiles. Once players do that, the boss usually becomes much easier as long as players can quickly jump between the projectiles and last long enough to defeat it. I've beaten the boss multiple times, and it took me eons to finally memorize its pattern and react fast enough to survive, but when I did finally beat the boss, I felt incredible and like I truly accomplished something I wasn't meant to accomplish. Now, once again, I don't recommend using artificial difficulty to create satisfaction in most situations, and I would definitely avoid it whenever possible. After all, while it can end up doing something positive in the end, that's not a guarantee, and that's after it usually destroys the player's sense of satisfaction and engagement. Artificial difficulty isn't the only way difficulty can hurt game feel though. It's not uncommon for gameplay to lose its level of satisfaction completely if the difficulty is too easy and doesn't present a challenge to the player. Easy gameplay can be fun and engaging if you're looking to relax, but it's much harder to create satisfaction when you can't feel accomplished. On the other hand, difficulty that's too unforgiving can also decimate game feel, even if the gameplay is 100% fair. This is what happened for Volgar the Viking. The game feels great to play. The controls are intuitive, the audio-visual feedback is satisfying, and the gameplay is fair, yet challenging. In fact, the game is so challenging that it includes very few checkpoints in each level, which are fairly long in length. The game is made even more unforgiving thanks to the playable character only being able to take 1 or 2 hits before dying at most times. Now, a game being unforgiving isn't necessarily bad. Some people, including myself, can enjoy this level of difficulty, but most will just end up angry and annoyed thanks to the punishment for death feeling unfair and not worth the satisfaction of finally progressing. Because gameplay that's too easy for players and gameplay that's too difficult for players can both hinder game feel, not to mention the player's enjoyment of the game, I highly recommend trying to find a middle ground that would please or satisfy most players and gradually increase the difficulty from there on as the game progresses. You may remember that in the beginning of this episode, I mentioned how if the visuals, audio, controls, and gameplay design all worked in harmony and helped the gameplay become satisfying or engaging, good game feel is usually achieved. Well, I said usually for a reason. There are other issues outside of these 4 aspects that can arise, and they need to be avoided to prevent the game feel from being ruined. Glitches can be inconsequential, but at the very least they can break immersion, which makes the gameplay less engaging. When the glitches are at their worst and they drastically change how the gameplay is meant to function, the overall game feel can take a hit. So, I would definitely remove those types of glitches and any other known bugs before the game is released. Lag, or frames per second slowdown of any kind, often throws off the timing of the gameplay, which can cause the animations and sound effects to become desynced and no longer improve the game feel. Because of this, I highly recommend optimizing your code as much as possible and including options that allow the user to change the graphics settings to help guarantee that the game runs smoothly on their computer, phone, or console. Options that allow users to rebind control schemes, use alternate input devices, change the vibration intensity, lower or higher the difficulty level, and customize the volume of audio elements like sound effects, music, and voices all help improve game feel as well. Avoiding sensory overload, which occurs due to an abundance of distracting feedback, is also important because it usually destroys game feel and causes gameplay to feel awful. Hyperactive visuals, intense audio, excessive controller vibration, or a combination of all 3 makes games hard to play and even harder to enjoy. Cave Story Plus has great game feel, but it also suffers from sensory overload. When most enemies are defeated, they explode and a sound effect is played. Experience triangles then fly out of the explosion and make a sound every time they bounce. Certain guns also play multiple sounds every time they're fired, and all the bullets all have explosion animations that play every time a bullet connects with an enemy or surface. Sometimes, when fighting a boss or a large number of enemies, sensory overload is created by countless experience triangles, explosions, and visual effects being shown all over the screen, in addition to the sounds they play, the enemies or boss attacking while making sounds of their own, and the rest of the visuals along with the background music. This can be prevented by designing unimportant visuals to not distract the player and mixing the audio volume levels in a way that makes sure the unimportant sound effects or music don't drown out the rest of the audio. Simply cutting down on the number of distracting visuals and audio also works, but if left unchecked, sensory overload will most likely distract, disorient, or even sicken players, thus making the game artificially difficult or more annoying to play. One last way game feel can be hurt is by not matching the player's expectations. When playing a game, every player brings with them pre-existing expectations on how everything should behave and control. For example, if you saw a character from a 2D perspective, you'd most likely instantly think that the character moves from left to right on the screen, but if you tried moving and you could only move up and down, you'd most likely feel like something is wrong. A less extreme example can be found in games that have a source material of some kind, whether it be a previous game, a spiritual successor, or another form of media. Take the Spider-Man games for example. The most iconic attributes of Spider-Man are how he can crawl on walls and swing from webs. Almost every person who is familiar with the character would agree that these actions should feel very fluid and that it should be easy to switch between more traditional movement and web swinging or wall crawling in the blink of an eye. The Spider-Man game, based off the 2002 movie, failed to match the expectations of players who are familiar with the source material by creating web swinging that feels very limited and slow, while also making it difficult to smoothly wall crawl onto surfaces. Because of this, all of the gameplay feels off or jarring to most players. When attempting to match expectations and decide how something with a source material should act, I recommend taking said source material into account by analyzing it and determining what actions are iconic, what tone would best fit the source, and what type of gameplay would seem like a natural fit. If possible, I also recommend using iconic or at least similar sound effects, music, designs, and actors to help capture the feel of the source. Additionally, when attempting to match expectations and decide how something without a source material should act, research and if possible test to see how it works, or go off your own knowledge and experience with games and reality. In the end, if the game matches expectations while avoiding issues like sensory overload, and if the visuals, audio, controls, and how the gameplay itself is designed all work together in harmony and help the gameplay become satisfying and engaging, good game feel should be achieved. I've been Supersonic 7CE, and hopefully I'll see you next time.